voting rights in Georgia. For those of you who may not know, I am Claire Gordon Todd. I do currently the Georgia Breakout Informational Discussion Group for the Indiana African American Genealogical Association. We are 25-year strong, getting ready to celebrate our anniversary. A conference coming up in September, genealogical group with people of color, African descendants of the Americas from all over who primarily live or connected to the state of Indiana. We have breakout groups as far as Mississippi, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, who meet in trying to research our ancestry from those original colony states and southern border states into the state of Indiana and the connections of our people in their journeys and travels into the state of Indiana and their experiences through genealogical records, obituaries, and other documents once they got to Indiana. One of the major parts of our research, of course, are the Civil War records and the amazing contributions that African Americans in Indiana and Northern Kentucky played in the Civil War for the Union. So it has been quite a journey. Today we have another gentleman, Dr. Damon McCoy, who will be giving a separate presentation on his family research and showing how the DNA tools of DNA Painter and DNA Sci can help you verify your genetic documents, how you can use documents and DNA to link your ancestry. So I am giving a very brief presentation on in celebration of our democracy and our right to vote. I'm doing a very brief presentation on how you find your ancestors' qualified voting record. Georgia was one of the states that had very clear qualified voting documents for African Americans, especially African Americans that had fought in the war on the side either of the Confederacy or those who quote unquote deserted to go to the side of the Union, or those who owned land, and especially those who owned land that was historical or very significant in the battles that were being fought of the Civil War. Often that land and structures on that land were used by one side or the other for what is now known to be very historical pieces of information, like where ammunition was stockpiled during the war. And so those African American families oftentimes had greater access to connections to people who were involved in the democratic quote unquote process in their state, and they often found a way to get a qualified voting record. So I talked very briefly in this presentation about how you do that, which is you put in your ancestor's name, you search military, oftentimes their military records appear, and normally the qualified voter's record with their name, their race, either colored or white, their district number, in this case, my ancestor, George F. Hamilton, my third great-grandfather who did fight in the Civil War and owned land, came up. I've had this for years, as has the Hamilton family. My father's mother's people have had this document for some time. And his race appears as colored. His district appears as number 87 in Sparta, Hancock County, where the family lived. And there's some additional records connected to the cotton farm that they farmed there, which was their land. So it's a great celebratory time for all people, especially those people of color, to remind themselves of all that their ancestors went through to vote. And those qualified voting records should be near and dear to everybody's heart these days. So I also wanted to give just a very brief piece about how did it all begin? And so my first slide here, as you can see, says we're enjoying the freedom even with all that we go through in today's world, there's still a freedom we enjoy that our ancestors voted for. I ask on this next slide, how is the way we live today directly connected to our ancestors' fight for the right to vote? And oftentimes, the qualified voting records for African Americans were connected to the fact that they fought in wars, they worked on others' land, in this case sharecropping. Many African Americans were sharecroppers. They did heinous domestic labor for years and years and years, but even though that labor was heinous and difficult, it did link them to places and people of power, which oftentimes gave them some access to abilities to get involved in the process of voting and in the process of civil rights, because we know that African Americans really didn't have the right to vote until much later. And we all know the different marked dates and celebratory dates that we celebrate today that mark those anniversaries of those rights to vote and the different amendments that do so as well. They endured from the very beginning, the Middle Passage. They stayed in domestic work to stay in their homes and on their land. So in other words, they took lesser pay and lesser status in life to keep something that was more. And we find that that's happening again in the times we live in today. They stood in long lines in life, and they endured Jim Crow. So we want to always reflect on all our ancestors did to secure our right to vote and to hold on to our right to vote. It wasn't easy. This is my third great grandfather's document. This is held by the keepers of the family history, which I believe I am one, but I'm blessed that the larger Hamilton family, those who still carry the name Hamilton, also have. I found this document on my own and was very grateful to find that it was also in the treasury of the Hamilton records by those people who carry the name Hamilton. There is his name, George Hamilton. The registry date is July 30th, 1867. That would be 3 years after, quote unquote, the end, or sort of the end, 1964, 1965 of the Civil War. As I say in my presentation, remember that General Robert E. Lee issued his edict that every able-bodied man must fight in 1864. This is after Abraham Lincoln had already allowed African Americans to fight for the Union, and the Union was winning. And then Lee decides and realizes, as they are experiencing a bloody aftermath in so many of those southern states, they're losing, that he's going to allow African Americans to fight in the form of his comment, every abled body. And so 3 years later, after the war is somewhat over, the Union has remained in the South, and the Union, the United States of America, is still gathering itself back together from a group of southern states which abandoned it, succeeded, left democracy. And so as that happened, those people that participated in Confederate activities had to swear their allegiance back to the Union and the United States. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that this is how you have to find your qualified ancestors' voting record. In some cases, there is a link to the Civil War for an ancestor that fought on either side, and sometimes there's not. Sometimes they were just able to get that qualified voting record. But imagine what they went through, and imagine what an important document that was to them. So it has the location, Hancock County, where all my family is, and many still reside today. His race, colored, the record type, it's a return of qualified voters, and the election district, District 20. As I reflected on this, I've somewhat taken it for granted. I've now found these documents for, I think all of my third or fourth great grandfathers, on especially on my father's side. So I've found a lot of records for my father's people from Georgia, and it seems as if Georgia in particular did a pretty good job of this. I haven't found as many on my mother's side, which are primarily in North Carolina and Virginia, but in Georgia and South Carolina, my father's people, I'm finding a lot of documents having to do with voting records, which is very interesting. And it prompted me to think, how did this all begin, and what was the history of what was going on right around that time. So I'm thinking about 1867. I start to research, and I immediately start to find on the web information going back to the 1860 election, which was the election that made the decisions about Abraham Lincoln, probably our most controversial president ever to this date, because he is the president that launched the ideas which were already out there from the abolitionists. He dared and had the audacity to put into manifestation the launching pad of the vision of the abolitionists and the millions of oppressed people, the slaves, that he might end slavery in these United States. So the next part of the presentation is a brief history of that election. I want to give credit to Michael Levy, who did most of the research of this for the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it was updated July 28th of 2024. I go over the history of the vote, that it was, when we think about the qualified voting records, most of whom, if you're African American, you're going to find those voting records from 1867. So a lot of the gathering and the beginning of that effort started with the 1860 vote, and the United States presidential election of 1860, in which the Republican Abraham Lincoln did defeat Breckinridge, a Democrat, and Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, and Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. And we talk about in the presentation, and you can see from the electoral map, how the Northern and Southern Democrats split. And this is one of those very historical elections where things happened in the country that haven't happened since, could happen again, but haven't happened since and hadn't happened before, because of the contentious issue of that peculiar institution known as slavery. The Southern Democrats did not see things the way the Northern Democrats did. The conventions took place and went forward as usual. The parties in the U.S. Constitution trying to transcend the sectional divide was the Constitutional Union Party, which was formed in 1859 by former Whigs and members of the Know Nothing Party. The Constitutional Unionists named former Senators John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts as their presidential and vice presidential nominees, respectively. The party's platform particularly appealed to the border states in its attempt to ignore the slavery issue and focused instead on the fealty and the frailty of the U.S. Constitution. So interesting that the border states, Indiana and Missouri, the Show Me State, the states in question, decided that they weren't going to take on the issue of slavery. They were going to take on instead the issue of the United States Constitution, which of course is what ultimately everything should, measure up to the United States Constitution. But they absolutely refused to look at slavery as a separate issue and to even so much as discuss it or to name it. And because they did that, different parties and different candidates arose to deal with that issue. And as that occurred, there was a severe split between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Nominations and election results. After his nomination, and this is very interesting, we just had a Democratic convention. We just had a Republican convention. So this is fresh on everybody's mind. After his nomination, he did become nominated. He did become indeed the nominee. So after his nomination, what did Abraham Lincoln do? He put aside his law practice and ran a quiet stay-at-home campaign. Interesting, very interesting. We think about an assassinated president having to run or choosing to run a quote-unquote stay-at-home campaign in which he made no stump speeches, though he did give full time to the direction of his campaign. His main object, he had written, was to hedge against divisions in the Republican ranks, and he counseled party workers to say nothing on the points where it is probable we shall disagree. We know that the Republicans then were very different, perhaps we could say, than the Republicans today. The Republicans were the party of, progress. They were the progressives. They were the party of no slavery. They were the party of abolitionists. And if you look at your history, you'll see how many people would claim or not claim that the Republican and the Democratic Party have somewhat switched places. Most African Americans that come from long-term American families. In other words, they're not East Indian or West African or from some other country. They are direct descendants of the Middle Passage in colonial America, who can trace their roots, beyond the 1800s to the colonies of these United States, would tell you that they can remember when their grandparents or their great-grandparents were Republicans. They were proud to be from the party of Abraham Lincoln because he had sort of, rescued the slaves. He had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And they can tell you that in the 1960s, with the civil rights legislation of John F. Kennedy, their family became Democrats. So those are two very historical markers of the African American placement in political election results. The electoral votes, despite four main candidates, with Douglas and Lincoln dominant in the North, and Breckinridge and Bell dueling for support in the South. On election day, Lincoln captured slightly less than 40% of the vote, but he won a majority of the Electoral College with 180 electoral votes by sweeping the North, with the exception of New Jersey, which he split with Douglas, and also winning the Pacific Coast states of California and Oregon. Just amazing when you study the history of the Electoral College. Two-party system. And I added this to remind ourselves of the brilliance of our founding fathers and the brilliance of the check and balance system that they put into our democracy, and how it always works. It always works itself out when you play true to the vision of the founding fathers. The 1860 election is regarded by most political observers as the first of the three critical elections in the United States contest that produced sharp and enduring changes in the party loyalties across the country. After 1860, the Democratic and Republican parties became the major parties in a largely two-party system, meaning it was clear that when the founding fathers meant two parties, they meant it. Allowing other parties to spring up and thinking that that would work proved false. It wouldn't work. What proved true was the founding fathers' vision that a two-party system is the best way to check and balance the American electorate. And that's what happened. The two parties controlled Congress for almost equal periods, though the Democrats held the presidency only the two terms of Grover Cleveland, 1885 through 89, and 1893 through 97. So when you look at it, and you look at the span of years, of 100 years over the 1800s, you see that equally each party held an equal amount of time in power, which is your check and balance proof. And that's what you have to have for a democracy: equality and justice. The results of the 1860 U.S. presidential election are provided in the table. And you can see Abraham Lincoln with his 180 electoral votes, his popular votes, John C. Breckinridge, Stephen A. Douglas, and John Bell. And I always remind people that if you're here today and you survived the Middle Passage, that heinous reality from Africa, the only thing as heinous or more heinous, and I would say as heinous, the Holocaust of the Jewish people at the hands of Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. Just heinous. Our Holocaust is the Middle Passage and the survivors and the descendants of that heinous reality known as slavery and colonialism. You're a patriot. You're a patriot because you survived. So it is resolved that it is both the part of patriotism and of the duty to recognize no political principles other than the Constitution of the country, the Union of the States, and the enforcement of the laws, and that as representatives of the constitutional union, men and women of the country in national convention assembled, we hereby pledge ourselves to maintain, protect, and defend, separately and unitedly, these great principles of public liberty, national safety, against all enemies at home and abroad, believing that thereby peace may once more be restored to the country, the rights of the people and the states reestablished, and the government again placed in that condition of justice, fraternity, and equality, which under the example and constitution of our fathers has solemnly bound every citizen of the United States to maintain a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Amen. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you for joining with me and for the Indiana Genealogical Association, the Indiana African American Association of Genealogy, in our continued quest to celebrate our patriotism, to celebrate our democracy, to celebrate our ancestry, and to celebrate those ancestors who struggled and suffered through the most heinous of times, the Middle Passage, slavery, colonialism, and indeed Jim Crow, and continue to fight for the rights of their posterity to live in a more perfect union. I'm Claire Gordon Todd. Please find me at Heritage Hopes. I always hope to offer support for all who are continuing on their genealogical and lineage historical journey. Thank you.